Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. John and I have been working together for several years talking through some of his research on DLP and our solution to address data loss. John has over 25 years of experience in the industry and wrote several articles on what we are going to talk about today, including Rethinking DLP, which is the next evolution of how companies are fighting the data breach problem. I am the CEO of Identity Finder and was previously a director at PwC, which is PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I built and led the practice for implementing DLP solutions. We've learned a lot from our experience on that side of the equation, and we'll talk more about how we evolved the solution and now help organizations. I co-founded Identity Finder while at Harvard Business School and have grown the company to over 1,000 customers, all focused on reducing risk, managing compliance, protecting their reputation, and of course, preventing data leaks.
There has been a seismic shift in the world around data. And so I'm going to be talking to you about how data is like oil, but what I want you to understand is with Target, we just experienced a huge data breach or a huge oil breach, and it caused so many reverberations throughout the world because the CEO and the CIO were fired and board members were replaced. So it's important for you to understand that we live in a post-Target world. Up until December of 2013, it was BT before Target. Now we live in the year 1, AT, after Target. And Target changes everything, and it changes it all globally. So what are we going to have to do, right? How come DLP and all these other technologies we invested in didn't stop the Target breach? Well, the reason is because we're thinking of DLP as a product, not a function and not a process. And so it's important that we rethink DLP. So this is our DLP maturity model. And notice how there's multiple different types of DLP in the world: endpoint, email, web, network, and gateway. And then there are different things that you have to do in order to make this process work: discover, classify, consolidate. All these are things you have to do to your data. Then you need to design your systems, and then finally, when you've done all that work, you need to enforce it. So until you do these things and rethink DLP, you're not going to be able to stop these data breaches and these oil spills. And this data economy is so important to us. We, all of us, all of our companies are either data originators, data aggregators, data analyzers, or data clients, and sometimes we're multiples of those things. So we use data every single day. Data is so important, and we need to become more data-centric, and we can't do it by thinking about it in the same way we have been thinking about it. So what I want you to take away is not only a focus on data, but understanding what data you need to protect, because in reality, you can talk about data in these theoretical terms, but when we think of it as oil, there's only two types of data. There's data that somebody wants to steal, right? And then there's everything else. And so what we're trying to do is protect the data that people want to steal, because the data that people want to steal is important to them because it can be monetized, first of all, or it can be used in some other activities, such as getting yourself a competitive edge in a business. So it might be part of a cyber espionage, economic espionage, corporate espionage kind of campaign, something like that. So we need to think about this data in new ways and focus on the types of data that will get us in trouble, because it's stolen data that gets us in trouble with regulators and legal entities. So we've developed something we call the 4 Ps. And the 4 Ps stand for the types of data that you need to think about. PCI, which is credit card data, stands for payment card industry. PHI, protected health information. This is all kinds of healthcare information, and if that gets spilled, as you've seen on the news probably, you're in trouble with all kinds of regulators. Same is true with PII, personally identifiable information. This is the kinds of things such as maybe a social security number in the United States, that if it gets leaked, you're going to have the attorneys general of many states filing lawsuits against you. And then there's something called IP, intellectual property. This is what some people say is their secret sauce, the keys to the kingdom, their secret formula, all those kinds of things. And sometimes they're not very well protected. So a little formula to help you remember this is that 3P, the PCI, PHI, and PI, plus IP or intellectual property equals TD, or toxic data. Toxic data is the stuff we want to protect. So how do you know whether your data is toxic? That's the question that you have to ask. And if you can't answer that, then you're at a disadvantage because probably your attackers know what toxic data you have. And over time, as a result of Target, we're going to see the rise of people who care much more about data. We already have chief privacy officers who want to ensure that the data is protected from a policy perspective. And then we have marketing people, and boy, they want to use that data. And then the CISO is probably told to protect that data, but they may not know where it is. And we're going to see the rise more and more of a role called the Chief Data Officer. And if your company doesn't have one, you need to think about getting a Chief Data Officer, or at least a data champion, somebody who will treat data as a business asset and a revenue stream so that they can focus on data quality and strategy and governance and help you protect your data. The first thing you need to understand is controlling your data seems like a big unsolvable problem to a lot of organizations. And the first thing that you want to do is break it into two distinct projects or processes. Your legacy data should be separate from your new data. So if you were to say to me, how do I start? Where do I start? When do I start knowing my data? The answer is now. You start now wherever you are, and don't allow your legacy data to encumber your ability to begin a good data security program. So you have new data, you have legacy data. Legacy data needs to be a separate project, and what's interesting about legacy data is that there's no creator, it's already been created. But with new data, you can actually start at the point of creation if you want to. And so understanding the relationship of the stakeholders in the data flow, the creators, the owners, the users, and the auditors is especially important as you begin to understand your data more and more deeply. Now, a lot of people are very scared of data classification, and that's because our old models of data classification are based upon paper. They're analog, and they're complex, and they're based upon human intuition, except computers don't work that way. So instead of thinking about how you need to classify it based upon your own opinion, you need to classify data based upon the way in which you're going to protect the data. So we're going to invert this process of classifying data. So instead of saying this is top secret data, how should we protect it, we look at a piece of data and we say, how should we protect this piece of data, and the way in which we need to protect it will determine its level of classification. So for example, if you don't need to do anything to a piece of data except perhaps delete it or dispose of it when it's old, then that's unclassified data. If you need to add inspection and access control to a piece of data, then that data becomes toxic. And if you need to encrypt, tokenize, or mask the data, then you classify it as radioactive because you have to kill that data. So you need to know your data. You need to understand your data so that you can protect your data. And so when we talk about identity, this is going to be one of the key things moving forward, is having data identity so you can treat data as if it's living. We talk about user identity because it's about a living person, but folks, no human being has ever gone on a network. A user is just an assertion of an identity and the device that generates traffic or generates the packets. Users are a type of packet on a network. The same with applications. We understand that there are identity attributes to an application, that there's a difference between Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, even though they're all using HTTP or HTTPS, they're not the exact same application. So we define that as application identity, but it's still a set of packets that move across the network. And we need to do the same thing to data. And so by giving data identity attributes, we can have persistent metadata that goes along with our data everywhere and tells us where that data was located, who created it, when it was created, what its classification is, what type of data is it? Is it a drawing, or is it a formula, or is it a string of compliant characters like a social security number? We can have all this stuff available to us, and this is going to help us not only know how to respond to any data that we see traversing our network, it's going to help us with other issues such as doing search against encrypted data, which is one of the reasons a lot of people don't want to encrypt their data, because they think it'll break their business intelligence processes. So we're always looking at new ways to think about this, but the context that we get from identity is so important in the future. We already understand users traversing our network, again, a specific packet type, and then applications traversing our network, again, a specific packet type. And what we're going to be adding to this whole equation is the context of the data, a specific packet type that we call data identity. And this is the future of data security, knowing your data, because once you know your data, then you can write the proper rules so you can respond to what your data is actually doing. And by continuously monitoring the interaction between users, applications, and the data itself, we have a much better chance of keeping our data from being exfilled into the hands of malicious actors, which quite frankly should be job one for all of us. So remember, data is the new oil. You need to be focused on your data. Get focused on data. Become data-centric. Everybody's looking for a magic button. Everybody's looking for the easy button. Everybody's looking for the silver bullet. I will tell you, my customers are now getting to the point where they're going to go in and make the effort to understand their data. It's not easy, but it's the only way to solve these big problems and prevent the types of data breaches that we saw with Target. Because, you know, folks, you need to understand the cost of a data breach is so huge. It's going to be more than $1 billion when this is said and done. And that doesn't even include things like brand reputation and all the other impacts. But this has gotten the notice of the executive suite. We've never seen a data breach where the CEO was fired because of it. And so this has set a precedent in the enterprise, and that precedent says to the boards of directors, if there's a data breach, fire the CEO. So now your CEO better care more and more about your security, and especially the data security, because that's what gets you in trouble. That's what got Greg Steinhoff fired, was data breach, not an intrusion, not some kind of virus. Those things didn't get him fired. So we've given you this data security and control framework so that you can have a way to think about security in a more holistic way. Get more data focused. Understand the data that you're trying to protect, and then constantly define and dissect that data so that you're looking at the data and saying, is there good stuff or is there bad stuff going on inside there? And I want to know if there's bad things happening to my data or somebody's trying to steal my data. That's the most important thing, the fundamental thing that we have to shift to, is stopping data breaches. So know your data. Understand your data. Get familiar with your data. Make friends with your data. Because we live in a post-target data economy. That's just the way things are, whether you like it or not, whether you want to go back to the old days before there were breaches, before there were all kinds of bad guys. It's only going to get worse. We've got cyber criminals who are very incentivized to make lots and lots of money by stealing your data. It's a very good business because data has value. Raw data has value, and data that's been processed, data that's been refined has even more value. It has value to you, and it has value to criminals, and it has value to competitors. And so you need to understand that you cannot protect things that are invisible. If you can't see your data and know your data, there's no way you're going to protect it. It doesn't matter how much money you spend and how many controls you put in. If that data is invisible to you, you won't be able to protect it. And see, this is why some of these older concepts like DLP fail, because they don't have data knowledge and identity. It's not DLP that's the problem, it's the work that you have to do to make DLP effective that is the real issue that needs to be focused on.
What are the root causes of most data leaks? It is typically data at rest. For those of you in the healthcare industry, you'll maybe already know the statistic, but the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services looks at all the data breaches in their industry, and 97% of the ones from last year were data at rest. Expanding that out to many industries, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report shows that 2/3 of breaches would have been prevented with data at rest. So this is very significant because, again, we're trying to evolve the solution beyond a perimeter gateway and helping companies be more proactive. That toxic data, that radioactive material that John mentioned, being able to stay one step ahead of the criminals and the hackers and the identity thieves out there, or even your employees that might make mistakes, is going to be critical, because if the data doesn't exist or the data is protected, there's not going to be something to block at the perimeter. John started to really go into some of the scary outcomes of what happens when a corporation or organization has a data breach. Some important statistics to mention, because of the topic of this webinar being, about the post, target era. $61 million in expenses. So if you think about what problem you're trying to solve with technology and processes that help manage sensitive data, it's not just saying I'm minimizing risk or preventing a data leak. It literally is lowering costs. Being able to avoid settlement costs, post-breach credit monitoring, increasing staffing to call centers, legal, of course, these all come into play. Now, it's not just the cost after a breach. There's also the loss of revenue. Target had reported a 5.5% drop in sales. There was another report that showed the customer attrition rates. 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 customers will stop doing business with either a healthcare provider, a retailer, or a bank if they announce that they have a data breach. The other thing is, when speaking to the point of lowering costs, sometimes it's just about knowing where to focus your resources. We have found many customers are looking to know, where should I be allocating resources and spending security dollars? They don't want to treat every asset in the company as equal. So by knowing where sensitive data is, or as John said, the radioactive and toxic data, you'll know which are your critical assets that you need to spend more time and energy protecting. We get a lot of questions in terms of, what is the cost of a breach, and there's a lot of statistics out there, but one that we thought very relevant is the recent breach at the New York Presbyterian Hospital, showing that there was over $700 in costs per record, and that was due to the $4.8 million in settlement costs that they had due to the leakage of 6,800 patients' information to the web. And the OCR investigation found specifically that the cause of that was not doing enough to identify the systems that had the sensitive info. So how do we help? How should you think about this problem? We don't believe it's just about, data discovery. It means doing something more meaningful with the information. What do you do once you're able to say, okay, we have a problem, or okay, we understand where all our data is? It's about data classification, making sure people aren't doing something with the data. Data protection, making sure someone else can't get it. Data governance, being able to assign accountability and uphold that. And the entire solution that combines all 4 of these facets is what we call Sensitive Data Manager. So I'll go into that in a little more detail, starting with the most important piece, because after all, if you don't know where your data is, you can't do anything to protect it. So that's data discovery. We look at this as a very three-dimensional problem. It's knowing what the data is, where it is, and who has access to it. So John walked you through the 4 Ps. I won't go through that, but the next piece, of course, is the where. Now that you know what you care about, where is it? And being able to take steps and saying, okay, we have 1,000 devices that contain, let's say, PII and PCI data. How do you shrink that footprint down? Can you minimize the number of laptops or file servers or emails that contain that data so that if something gets through, which we all know something will one day, if something gets through, it has a much smaller target of information to steal. And shrinking that footprint is what helps accomplish that risk minimization. Now, once you've done that, it doesn't end there because you still have people within the company who have access to that. And that gets to the who piece, the third dimension of understanding, okay, now that we have been able to consolidate as much as possible and get our footprint to be as small as possible, there's still a lot of people in the company with access to it, which means, let's say it's a hacker that's attacking us. They could use any one of those individuals to access that information, sort of a launch pad for the attack. So understanding who has access and then minimizing that access is going to be a big step towards minimizing that risk. It doesn't end there, of course, because the problem is you can't get rid of everything. And that's where data classification comes in. It helps create that user awareness. It almost gives data a voice to be able to scream to the end user, hey, before you try to attach me to an email message or before you post this to Dropbox or another cloud system, please know I contain 1,000 social security numbers. This helps fix a lot of bad behavior and promote a safe culture, and it really helps avoid a lot of the mistakes. It almost makes having to block at the perimeter completely obsolete. If data owners had that accountability and were empowered to know what's in the data that they're using, a lot of them wouldn't make those mistakes. The next piece, of course, is trying to shrink that footprint. So what you've kept, you've now classified. You know what's important to you, what's not important, and what's not important, you probably need to get rid of. This might be, as John described, a lot of that legacy data. Maybe you no longer need credit card numbers that are over a year old or even a few months old, perhaps. Maybe there's a lot of old customer data, student data, patient data, what have you. I will say this, we're not trying to be endpoint protection and do everything for everyone. We're taking the most core functionality and making what's relevant to data discovery available to you so that you can shrink that footprint. And this can be an automatic or manual process, but the idea is get rid of some of that legacy data you no longer need that contains sensitive data. Shrink that footprint down by shredding the files you don't need. If you do need the files but you don't need that toxic data John mentioned, redact the toxic data but leave the rest of the file intact. If you need everything, at least encrypt it. Now, whole disk encryption is nice, but the problem is if someone's logged in, the data is fully accessible. So like in the case of Target where there's malware on the system while the system's on, full disk encryption doesn't help at all. Another thing that could help, though, is per file encryption, native encryption, like if you used Word or Excel or a PDF or PowerPoint or something like that where malware can't get access to the data. That would be something along the lines of encryption. And then if you don't know what to do, one of the biggest use cases we've seen with many of our customers is that they like to quarantine the data, basically securely removing that access from everyone so that they no longer can use the data. And what happens is you'll get a very small percentage of people who say, wait a minute, I needed that. But you've been able to eliminate probably 90% of the data that's out there. And for those who need it, you remove it from the quarantine and then promote good behavior by making sure they either use encryption or other steps to secure it, or they classify it so that they know not to make mistakes with it. Again, the example of posting it to the cloud or shoving it in an email attachment. Finally, data governance. This is something that has come up a lot lately. We're not a GRC platform, of course, but what we're trying to do is help align data assets with business owners so that accountability can be assigned and that employees can take the right steps to make sure that there's a minimal amount of access to the files that they own. And then, of course, this speaks to the compliance piece of making sure that you're up to date with regulations, and answering the questions of who owns the data, who has access to the data, when was the data last accessed? Perhaps it's obsolete. If no one's touched the file in 90 days, maybe we quarantine it. If no one still tries to come back and get it out of the quarantine, maybe we shred it. Let's shred everything after 90 days if people haven't accessed it. Each business, of course, is going to have different requirements, but the concept here is to make sure that there's a process in place to govern what your users are doing, being able to see who's accessing what, why they're accessing it, and then you'll be able to make better business decisions about what should be classified and what should be basically destroyed or secured in a way that less people can obtain access to it. So we've talked a little bit about data discovery, data classification, data protection, and data governance. This, we believe, is a life cycle. Discover, classify, remediate, monitor, and report, and it repeats itself. We call this solution sensitive data management, and our product is Sensitive Data Manager, but the value that's being added is helping organizations, first of all, identify what the problem is, helping them define the size of their footprint, helping them classify the data in that footprint and potentially shrink that footprint down, remediate what doesn't need to be there anymore, use some of those data protection tools to make sure that there's less access so that you could literally answer the question, here's how many computers in my environment that would cause a data breach if they were stolen or hacked into. Here's how many employees could cause a data breach if their account was compromised and used to access information. The most important thing, which I think a lot of companies are now really starting to get, is it's all about data discovery, and discovery is only good as the accuracy. So at Identity Finder, this is the area we focus on most because we have learned, both through my efforts at PricewaterhouseCoopers before starting the company, and also through customers that have made a lot of mistakes and come to us and said, how do we solve the problems of false positives? This is where people are being inundated with information that is completely meaningless to them, and they want to really focus on what's critical. So we have always focused on accuracy in our products and made sure that we're using the most comprehensive search techniques so that you're only seeing things that are relevant to you. And we do that through validation algorithms. A great example is if you want to Google or search the internet for a credit card number, you will find lots of sample credit card numbers out there. Pretty much every product on the market finds those credit card numbers. Unfortunately, they're fake, and there's a lot of reasons that they're fake. Most often the case is because 555-444, 555-444 is not a real credit card number, and it can't be a real credit card number. But because historically DLP products did pattern matching, that 16-digit number, which coincidentally passes the Loon algorithm, was found. And these are the types of examples of things that inundate companies with a lot of wasted time. So we use validation algorithms to do a lot more checks and make sure that we're looking at the context of the information. That's really, the focus of our discovery. Of course, we make sure we look everywhere, including, even shadow volumes, but, images, files, emails, etc. Data classification is the next really critical piece. Our process allows you to do manual classification, but that's very onerous. Our big differentiator is automatic classification so that your employees aren't the ones who have to click through hundreds or thousands of files, thinking through what's inside them and manually classifying them. Our process is automatic. Because the search is finding the data, it has a lot of information about that data, like who has access to it, who the data owner is, what's inside it, what type of file it is, where it's located, what organizational unit within Active Directory is the data owner, and then you can use a lot of that criteria to define, is this going to be something that we call top secret or confidential or public or PCI data or patient information or HR employee data, etc. The automatic classification really empowers you through a workflow to make that whole process very easy and very quick. The next piece is the protection, to making sure that we don't just point the finger and say you have a big problem, here's the size of your footprint. It's going through and helping you minimize that exposure. And then data governance and in those auditing technologies that are out there, for us it's really about making sure that we're aligning the data owners with the assets and assigning that accountability so that your business unit managers or your administrators can track that sensitive data proactively and find who's cleaning up the problem, who's not, and where the risk lies within the organization. So we have a very simple deployment model. Within a minute of purchasing, you receive your software and license, of course. But within an hour, you can get the Sensitive Data Manager console up and running on a Windows server. You can even have an endpoint package built. Now, you might want to customize some of those settings, but the truth is, it's a wizard-based interface that makes the process extremely easy. Within a day, you can have that endpoint deployed and complete your initial searches on whatever systems you want to start with. And that'll help you answer the question of knowing how many systems contain sensitive data, which files or emails, who the data owners are, and the last time they were accessed. So it helps you answer the questions within a day of who, what, and where. And within a week, that's when you can start to get into some of that workflow and have the data classified and protected, which is currently exposed. A lot of this is within a click of a button. Most of this has all been designed to not require professional services or heavy amounts of training. So with that, I believe I'm going to open it up to questions